creature that methodically dismantled my chicken coop stood 9 feet tall, covered in dark matted fur, and moved with a savagery that chilled me to the bone. I've watched this recording hundreds of times since that October night, and each viewing confirms what I've tried to deny. I wasn't losing my mind. They were real, and they had been watching me far longer than I'd been watching them. My name is Robert Patrick, and this is a story of why I abandoned the only home I'd known for 63 years, fleeing into the night like a man possessed. What I'm about to share isn't fiction, isn't the ramblings of a lonely old farmer gone senile. This is why my house now stands empty in the Montana wilderness, why I'll never return to the land that 5 generations of Patricks called home, and why I sleep with the lights on in my son's downtown apartment 3 states away. For 42 years, Margaret and I built our life on 127 acres of pristine wilderness nestled in the Bitterroot Mountains. Our nearest neighbor lived 18 miles down a dirt road that became impassable 4 months out of the year. We raised cattle, grew our own vegetables, kept chickens for eggs, and heated our home with wood. I cut myself from the forest that stretched endlessly beyond our property line. It was the kind of self-sufficient existence that people in cities dream about, but few have the courage to pursue. When Margaret passed 2 years ago after a brief battle with cancer, our 3 children begged me to sell the ranch and move closer to civilization. Sarah, my eldest, had become a successful attorney in Seattle. Michael worked as an investment banker in Chicago, pulling 80-hour weeks that left little time for family visits. David, my youngest, managed a tech startup in San Francisco and spoke in acronyms I couldn't understand. They visited for the funeral, stayed a week to help settle Margaret's affairs, then returned to their important lives in their important cities. I understood their concerns. Living alone on a remote ranch at my age carried obvious risks. A heart attack, a fall, a simple accident could leave me helpless with no way to call for help. Cell phone service didn't reach our valley, and the landline had been knocked out by falling trees more times than I could count. But this land was in my blood. My great-great-grandfather homesteaded here in 1887, and 4 generations of Patricks were buried in the small cemetery behind the house. Margaret's grave was the newest addition, marked by a simple granite stone that read, "Beloved wife and mother." So I stayed. I maintained the cattle, tended my garden, and kept a flock of 23 chickens that provided more eggs than one man could eat. The surplus I traded with the Kowalski family at the general store in Millerville, the nearest town 37 miles away. It was a quiet, predictable existence that suited me fine. I read by lamplight, listened to old radio programs on my battery-powered receiver, and found peace in the rhythms of rural life that had sustained my family for over a century. But I wasn't naive about the dangers lurking in the surrounding wilderness. The Bitterroot Mountains harbored black bears, mountain lions, wolves, and the occasional grizzly that wandered down from Glacier National Park. I'd lost livestock before, a calf taken by wolves, chickens killed by foxes or raccoons. It was the price of living where civilization ended and true wilderness began. I kept a loaded .306 by the front door and a .44 Magnum on my hip when working outside. Most predators gave humans a wide berth, but hunger could make any animal dangerous. The forest that bordered my property had always been a source of both beauty and unease. Ancient pines towered 200 feet into the sky, their canopy so thick that noon felt like twilight beneath their boughs. Game trails crisscrossed the undergrowth, worn smooth by generations of deer, elk, and bears following paths their ancestors had walked for millennia. I harvested deadfall for firewood and occasionally hunted the edges for venison, but I rarely ventured more than a quarter mile from the house. Something about the deep woods felt wrong, a primitive instinct that warned me away from places where man wasn't welcome. Over the years, I'd heard things in those trees that I couldn't explain, sounds that weren't quite animal, weren't quite human. Wood knocks that echoed through the forest at odd hours, vocalizations that resembled ape calls but carried an intelligence that made my skin crawl. Margaret used to dismiss these as my imagination or the ordinary sounds of wildlife, and I'd convinced myself she was right. Every forest had its mysteries, its unexplained noises. The mind could play tricks in the wilderness, especially during the long winter months when isolation pressed down like a physical weight. But after Margaret's death, when the house fell silent except for the tick of her grandmother's clock and the settling of old timbers, I began paying closer attention to the sounds from the forest. Without Margaret's rational explanations to comfort me, the night noises took on a more sinister quality. The wood knocks became more frequent, occurring in patterns that suggested communication. The vocalizations grew bolder, sometimes answered by similar calls from different directions. Most disturbing were the footsteps, heavy, deliberate, bipedal, that occasionally echoed from the tree line long after dark. During my first summer alone, I began finding signs that something large was moving through the forest near my property. Massive footprints in the soft earth near the creek, far too big to belong to any known animal. Trees with bark stripped away at heights no bear could reach. Arrangements of stones and sticks that seemed deliberate, almost ritualistic. I told myself these were natural phenomena, coincidence and imagination, combining to create patterns where none existed. The first livestock kill happened in late July. I found one of my young bulls dead in the pasture closest to the forest, its neck twisted at an impossible angle. The force required to break a 1,000-pound animal's neck was staggering. I assumed a grizzly had somehow taken it down, though I found no claw marks or typical signs of a bear attack. The carcass hadn't been fed upon, which struck me as odd. Predators kill to eat, not for sport. I dragged the body deep into the forest and tried to put the incident out of my mind. 2 weeks later, I lost 3 chickens in a single night. I found them scattered around the coop, not eaten but killed with what appeared to be surgical precision. Their necks had been snapped cleanly and the bodies were arranged in a rough triangle. Again, no signs of typical predation, no drag marks, no feeding, no obvious point of entry to the coop. It was as if something had reached through the wire mesh and killed them for the pleasure of killing. After the chicken incident, I reinforced the coop with heavier gauge wire and added a padlock to the door. I also installed motion-activated floodlights around the immediate area of the house, hoping to deter whatever was hunting my livestock. The lights triggered frequently during the first few nights, deer, elk, and other wildlife moving through the property, but gradually the nocturnal activity decreased. Either the animals had adjusted to the lights or something was keeping them away. It was during this period that Michael, my middle son, paid an unexpected visit. He'd taken a rare week off work and decided to check on his old man, as he put it. Michael had never fully embraced ranch life, preferring video games and computers to physical labor, but he understood technology in ways that often amazed me. When I mentioned the livestock kills and my concerns about security, he suggested installing a trail camera to monitor the chicken coop. We drove to the sporting goods store in Millerville and purchased a high-end camera designed for hunting surveillance. The device could record both photos and video triggered by heat and motion. It featured infrared night vision and could operate for weeks on a set of lithium batteries. Michael spent an afternoon positioning the camera to provide optimal coverage of the co-op and the surrounding area, then showed me how to review the footage on the small LCD screen. For the first month after Michael's departure, the camera recorded exactly what I expected. Raccoons attempting to raid the coop, deer browsing near the fence, and the occasional fox investigating the chicken wire. The nocturnal parade of wildlife was actually reassuring, proof that the ecosystem remained healthy and balanced. I began to relax, convinced that whatever had killed my livestock had moved on to easier hunting grounds. But as September turned to October and the nights grew longer and colder, something changed in the forest. The typical sounds of wildlife began to diminish, replaced by an unnatural silence that put me on edge. Even the wind seemed to whisper differently through the trees, carrying undertones that made me check the locks twice before bed. The cattle, usually content to graze peacefully in the pastures, became skittish and grouped together near the barn. They would stand motionless for long periods, staring toward the tree line with an intensity that suggested they sensed something I couldn't perceive. The first week of October brought an early frost that killed my remaining tomatoes and signaled the approaching winter. I spent my days preparing for the cold months ahead, splitting firewood, weatherproofing the barn, and checking my stockpile of canned goods and preserved meat. The routine work was comforting, a connection to generations of Patricks who had performed these same autumn rituals. But as darkness fell earlier each evening, I found myself increasingly aware of sounds from the forest that I couldn't identify or dismiss. The woodknocks returned with a vengeance, echoing through the trees in complex patterns that resembled coded communication. Sometimes a single knock would trigger a response from deep in the forest, followed by another answer from a different direction. The exchanges could continue for an hour or more, suggesting multiple participants in some form of dialogue. I tried to convince myself that woodpeckers or falling branches could create similar sounds, but the timing and patterns were too deliberate, too purposeful. More disturbing were the vocalizations, deep, guttural calls that seemed to combine the worst elements of human and animal communication. The sounds carried an intelligence that was unmistakably conscious, deliberate. They weren't the random hoots and howls of wildlife, but structured vocalizations that suggested language, even if I couldn't understand the meaning. On several occasions, I was certain I heard what sounded like my name being called from the darkness, spoken in a voice too deep and alien to be human. The trail camera began capturing anomalies that defied explanation. Brief glimpses of massive shadows moving at the edge of the frame, always too quick or too obscured to identify clearly. Heat signatures that appeared bipedal but far larger than any human. On 2 occasions, the camera captured what appeared to be glowing eyes reflected in the infrared flash. Eyes set too high and too far apart to belong to any known animal in the region. Most unnerving was the gradual approach of whatever was watching me. The first signs of activity had been recorded at the forest edge, nearly 100 yards from the chicken coop. But as October progressed, the mysterious presence grew bolder, venturing closer to the house each night. The cameras documented a pattern of reconnaissance that suggested intelligence and planning. Something was studying my routines, learning my habits, preparing for something I didn't want to contemplate. By the 3rd week of October, I was sleeping with the 30-06 beside my bed and the 44 Magnum within easy reach. Every sound triggered a rush of adrenaline that left me exhausted and paranoid. I found myself checking and rechecking the locks, peering through windows at shadows that might or might not contain threats. The isolation that had once brought peace now felt like vulnerability. I was completely alone, miles from help, facing something that existed outside the normal rules of nature. The cattle had abandoned the pastures closest to the forest, clustering around the barn even during daylight hours. Their behavior was unmistakable. They were terrified of something in those trees. Animals possess senses that humans have long since abandoned, instincts that warn of dangers we can no longer perceive. When prey animals display such obvious fear, predators are never far away. I considered driving to town and staying at the motel until whatever was stalking my property moved on. But this was my home, my family's land. Running away felt like cowardice, an abandonment of everything my ancestors had built. Besides, I had no guarantee that leaving would solve the problem. Whatever was out there might simply wait for my return, or worse, follow me into town. At least here I knew the terrain, had defensible positions, and possessed the weapons necessary to protect myself. The decision to stay would prove to be both the bravest and most foolish choice of my life. October 23rd started as an ordinary day. I fed the cattle, collected eggs from the chickens, and spent the afternoon splitting firewood behind the barn. The weather was crisp but pleasant, with brilliant blue skies and the kind of clarity that only comes in autumn. I prepared a simple dinner of venison stew and cornbread, ate while listening to an old radio drama, then settled into my reading chair with a Louis L'Amour novel. Outside, the first stars were appearing in a sky unburdened by light pollution. Around 9 o'clock, I noticed the unusual silence. No cricket chirps, no owl calls, no rustle of small animals moving through the underbrush. Even the wind had died to an unnatural stillness that pressed against the windows like a living thing. The cattle were nowhere to be seen, presumably huddled in the barn where they had been spending increasingly more time. The quiet was so complete that I could hear my own heartbeat, the tick of Margaret's clock, and the distant settling of the house's old timbers. I double-checked the locks on both doors, confirmed that the windows were secure, and made sure my weapons were loaded and accessible. The trail camera's battery indicator had shown full charge that morning, so I knew it would be recording whatever happened during the night. Part of me hoped for a peaceful evening that would prove my fears were nothing more than an old man's imagination. But a deeper, more primitive part of my brain was screaming warnings that I couldn't ignore. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by dreams of massive shapes moving through the forest and eyes watching from the darkness. I jerked awake several times, certain I'd heard something outside, but each time the night remained silent. The last thing I remembered was checking the bedside clock, 2:17 a.m., before exhaustion finally overcame anxiety and pulled me into deeper sleep. I woke to silence more profound than any I'd ever experienced. No morning bird songs, no cattle lowing in the pasture, no familiar sounds of wildlife beginning the new day. Pale dawn light filtered through the bedroom curtains, illuminating dust motes that danced in the still air. Something was wrong, terribly, fundamentally wrong. The kitchen window that overlooked the chicken coop provided a view that stopped my heart. The coop's wire mesh had been peeled away like aluminum foil, curled back in precise strips that spoke of incredible strength applied with surgical precision. The wooden frame remained intact, but the interior was a slaughterhouse. Feathers drifted in the morning breeze, stained with dark patches that could only be blood. Bodies were scattered throughout the enclosure and the surrounding yard, some partially eaten, others apparently killed for sport and left to rot. 23 chickens had gone to roost the previous evening. Now I counted 4 survivors, huddled together beneath the overturned water trough, too traumatized to flee. The carnage wasn't the work of foxes or raccoons, animals that might kill 1 or 2 birds before carrying their prey away. This was systematic destruction executed with a malevolence that chilled me to the bone. But it was the trail camera footage that shattered my rational worldview and replaced it with a reality far more terrifying than any nightmare. My hands shook as I activated the camera's playback function, scrolling through hours of recorded footage to find the moment when hell had visited my property. The early evening hours showed normal activity, a family of deer grazing near the fence, a raccoon testing the coop's defenses, an owl swooping through the frame in pursuit of prey. Nothing unusual, nothing threatening. Then, at 11:47 p.m., the darkness at the edge of the forest began to move. The infrared camera revealed what my eyes never could have seen in the pitch-black night. A massive humanoid figure emerged from the tree line, moving with a fluid grace that contradicted its enormous size. The creature stood easily 9 feet tall, its body covered in dark fur that seemed to absorb the camera's infrared illumination. Its proportions were wrong for any known primate, arms that hung nearly to its knees, shoulders broad enough to span a doorway, a head that sat directly on massive shoulders without any visible neck. But it was the intelligence in its movement that truly terrified me. This wasn't a mindless animal driven by hunger or instinct. The creature approached the chicken coop with deliberate purpose, pausing to examine the wire mesh before systematically dismantling my defenses. Its hands, and they were clearly hands, not paws or claws, worked with the precision of a master craftsman. It peeled away the heavy gauge wire as easily as I might tear paper, creating an opening large enough to admit its massive frame. What followed was a feeding frenzy that lasted nearly 30 minutes. The creature killed swiftly and efficiently, snapping necks with casual gestures that spoke of immense physical power. But this wasn't just feeding, it was destruction for the sake of destruction. The beast killed far more than it could possibly eat, leaving most of the carcasses untouched while selecting only choice pieces for consumption. It seemed to take pleasure in the slaughter, occasionally pausing to examine its handiwork before resuming the carnage. Most disturbing was the moment when the creature looked directly into the camera. Its eyes reflected the infrared flash like twin coals, and for a heartbeat that lasted an eternity, I felt as though it was staring directly at me through the lens. The intelligence in that gaze was unmistakable. This thing knew it was being recorded and didn't care. If anything, it seemed to be performing for the camera, demonstrating its power for my benefit. After completing its butchery, the creature gathered several of the chicken carcasses and disappeared back into the forest with the same fluid grace it had displayed upon arrival. The timestamp showed 12:23 a.m. when the last trace of movement vanished from the frame. The entire assault had taken 36 minutes from start to finish. I watched the recording 3 more times before the full reality of what I'd witnessed finally penetrated my shocked mind. Sasquatch, Bigfoot, whatever name you wanted to use for the legend that walked out of Northwest folklore, was real. And it had been hunting on my property, studying my routines, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The implications were staggering. If creatures like this existed in the deep wilderness, how many people had encountered them over the years? How many disappearances in national forests and remote areas could be attributed to predators that science refused to acknowledge? And most immediately terrifying, if this thing had been watching me for weeks or months, learning my habits, what did it plan to do next? The nearest telephone was at the Kowalski's General Store in Millerville, 37 miles of rough mountain roads that would take over an hour to traverse. But I needed to report what I'd witnessed, to get help before the creature returned. I loaded the trail camera into my old Ford pickup, checked that both my rifles were secure in the gun rack, and started the long drive to town. Millerville consisted of a general store, a gas station, a tiny post office, and perhaps 24 houses scattered along the main road. The Kowalski family had run the store for 3 generations, serving the scattered ranchers and loggers who made their living in the remote valleys. They knew everyone within 50 miles and had heard every tall tale the mountains could produce. If anyone would believe my story, it would be them. But when I showed Tom Kowalski the trail camera footage, his reaction wasn't what I'd hoped for. He watched the recording twice, shaking his head and muttering under his breath. When the creature looked directly into the camera, Tom actually stepped back from the small screen as if the thing might reach through and grab him. Tom suggested I contact the Forest Service Ranger Station in Hamilton, the county seat 40 miles south of Millerville. If something dangerous was roaming the wilderness, the rangers needed to know about it. They had the training and equipment to deal with predatory animals, and they would know what steps to take to protect the local population. Tom even let me use the store's landline to place the call. The conversation with Ranger Station Hamilton was brief and frustrating. The duty ranger listened politely as I described the attack on my livestock and the creature I'd recorded. When I mentioned the word Sasquatch, the tone changed immediately. The ranger's voice took on the patient, condescending quality reserved for children and the mentally impaired. He suggested that I might have recorded a bear standing on its hind legs, a trick of light and shadow that could make any animal appear larger and more threatening than it actually was. When I insisted that the creature was clearly bipedal, clearly intelligent, and clearly no bear, the ranger's patience evaporated entirely. He informed me that the Forest Service dealt with real wildlife management issues, not cryptozoological fantasies. If I was having problems with predators, I should contact the state wildlife agency. If I was experiencing mental health issues related to isolation and grief, I should seek appropriate medical attention. The call ended with a click that echoed like a gunshot in the store's sudden silence. Tom Kowalski's expression had shifted from concern to embarrassment during the phone conversation. He'd known me for 20 years, had done business with my family for longer than that, but now he was looking at me like I'd lost my mind. When he suggested that maybe the stress of living alone had gotten to me, that maybe I should consider moving closer to my children, I knew I was truly on my own. The drive back to the ranch seemed to take forever. Every shadow between the trees could hide a massive predator. Every movement in my peripheral vision triggered a spike of adrenaline that left me gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles went white. The isolation that had once been a source of strength now felt like a death sentence. I was completely alone with something that existed outside the boundaries of accepted reality, something that had demonstrated both intelligence and a taste for destruction. As my house came into view, I noticed that the cattle were nowhere to be seen. The pasture stood empty, and even the area around the barn appeared deserted. Either my livestock had wandered off in search of better grazing, or something had frightened them badly enough to drive them into the deepest corners of the forest. Given what I'd learned about my uninvited neighbor, I suspected the latter. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of mounting anxiety and sleepless nights. I replaced the destroyed chicken coop with a reinforced structure that resembled a fortress more than a simple enclosure. Heavy gauge steel mesh, double locks, motion sensors linked to floodlights, everything I could think of to deter another attack. But I knew my efforts were largely symbolic. If the creature wanted to destroy my defenses, no amount of wire and steel would stop it. I'd repositioned the trail camera to monitor a wider area, hoping to document the creature's return and perhaps learn more about its behavior patterns. The footage revealed a property under siege. Massive footprints appeared in the mud around the water tank. Trees at the forest edge showed fresh damage. Bark stripped away at heights that would require a ladder for a human to reach. Most disturbing were the arrangements of stones and sticks that appeared overnight, geometric patterns that clearly indicated intelligence and purpose. The creature was still there, still watching, still planning something I couldn't comprehend. Every shadow could hide a 9-foot predator. Every sound from the forest might herald another attack. I found myself starting at every creak of the house's old timbers, every gust of wind through the eaves. Sleep became impossible without chemical assistance, and even then, nightmares jerked me awake several times each night. The cattle had indeed vanished, either driven off by fear or taken by predators. I found scattered bones in the forest, rib cages picked clean, leg bones cracked open for marrow, but no signs of the animals themselves. The destruction was too complete, too efficient to be the work of natural scavengers. Something with human-level intelligence was systematically eliminating my livestock, and I was helpless to stop it. Food became a constant concern. My remaining chickens provided a few eggs, and I had plenty of canned goods and preserved meat. But the approaching winter meant I'd need to venture into town for supplies more frequently than I preferred. Each trip to Millerville felt like running a gauntlet, the forest pressing close on both sides of the narrow road. I found myself driving faster than was safe, desperate to reach the false security of human civilization. The isolation was taking its toll. Without Margaret's steady presence to anchor me to rationality, I felt myself sliding toward a paranoia that bordered on madness. I talked to myself constantly, filled the silence with radio programs, and recorded music. Anything to push back the suffocating quiet that invited dark thoughts. The house that had sheltered 5 generations of my family now felt like a prison, its walls no barrier against the intelligence that watched from the trees. I began making contingency plans. If the situation deteriorated further, I'd abandon the ranch and drive to Chicago to stay with Michael. The thought of leaving my family's land to whatever lurked in the forest was almost unbearable, but survival took precedence over sentiment. I kept a bag packed with essential belongings, maintained a full tank of gas in the pickup, and rehearsed the fastest route to the main highway. But I waited too long to implement my escape plan. The thing in the forest was growing bolder, and my time was running out. November 7th dawned gray and bitter, with the smell of snow in the air and storm clouds building over the mountain peaks. I'd slept poorly again, jarred awake by sounds that might have been breaking branches, or might have been something far worse moving through the forest. The trail camera's battery had died during the night, and I spent the morning installing fresh lithium cells and adjusting the angle to cover more of the yard. As afternoon faded to evening, the sense of impending catastrophe became overwhelming. Every instinct developed over 6 decades of life in the wilderness was screaming warnings I couldn't ignore. The forest was too quiet, the air too still, the shadows too deep. Even the wind had died to an unnatural calm that reminded me of the moments before a tornado touches down. I checked my weapons for the 100th time, confirmed that the pickup's keys were in my pocket, and reviewed my escape route. If something happened during the night, I'd grab my go bag and run for the truck without looking back. The ranch could be rebuilt. My life couldn't be restored if I lost it to whatever was stalking me from the trees. Darkness fell like a curtain, bringing with it the familiar sounds of wood knocks echoing through the forest. But tonight the pattern was different, more urgent, more aggressive. The knocks came in rapid succession, answered immediately by responses from multiple directions. Whatever was out there was communicating with others of its kind, coordinating something that would happen soon. Around 10 o'clock, the vocalizations began. Deep, guttural calls that raised the hair on my arms and sent primitive fear crawling up my spine. The sounds were definitely language, structured, purposeful, intelligent, but unlike anything in human experience. I counted at least 3 distinct voices, possibly more, suggesting that a group of the creatures had gathered in the forest surrounding my property. Then the footsteps started, heavy, deliberate, bipedal footfalls circling the house at a distance of perhaps 50 yards. I tracked the sounds through the windows, watching for movement in the darkness beyond the reach of my security lights. Whatever was out there was taking its time, studying my defenses, looking for weaknesses in my preparations. The footsteps would pause for long minutes, then resume in a different location, gradually tightening the circle around the house. By 11 o'clock, I knew I was in immediate danger. The sounds of movement had grown closer, and I could see shapes shifting in the darkness beyond the floodlight's range. Massive bipedal figures that moved with fluid grace despite their enormous size. When one of them stepped into the light's periphery, I caught a glimpse of dark fur and eyes that reflected the illumination like polished metal. I grabbed my go bag, checked that the .44 Magnum was secure in its holster, and headed for the back door where my pickup was parked. The keys felt slippery in my sweating hands as I fumbled with the lock, every second expecting to hear the crash of breaking glass or splintering wood as the creatures finally made their move. The truck started on the first try, a small miracle that probably saved my life. I threw it into reverse and backed away from the house without turning on the headlights, using only the dashboard illumination to navigate. When I was 30 yards from the building, I flicked on the lights and saw them. 2 massive figures were emerging from the forest, moving toward the house with purposeful strides. In the headlight beams, they were even more terrifying than the trail camera had revealed. 9 feet tall at minimum, covered in dark matted fur, with proportions that suggested immense physical power. Their eyes reflected the light like mirrors, and their movements carried an intelligence that was unmistakably conscious and deliberate. They paused when the headlights hit them, turning to stare directly at me through the windshield. For a moment that lasted an eternity, predator and prey regarded each other across 30 yards of open ground. Then one of them raised its arm, not a paw, but a hand with opposable thumb, and pointed directly at me. The gesture was so human, so deliberately threatening, that my blood turned to ice water. I floored the accelerator and tore down the ranch road without looking back. In the rearview mirror, I could see the two figures watching my retreat, standing motionless in the headlight glare until darkness swallowed them. Only when I reached the main forest road did I dare to breathe normally, and even then my hands shook so badly I could barely maintain control of the steering wheel. The 37-mile drive to Millerville had never seemed so long. Every shadow between the trees could hide another predator. Every curve in the road might reveal something standing in my path. Twice I thought I saw massive figures moving through the forest parallel to the road, keeping pace with my truck despite the rough terrain. But when I slowed to get a better look, the shapes vanished into the darkness like smoke. I reached Millerville at 12:47 a.m. according to the clock above the post office. The town was dark and silent, its handful of streetlights creating small pools of security in the wilderness night. I pulled into the gas station and sat in the truck for several minutes, letting my heartbeat return to something approaching normal. The familiar sight of buildings and pavement was incredibly reassuring after the primal terror of the forest road. Tom Kowalski lived in a small house behind the general store. I hated to wake him at such an hour, but I needed human contact, needed to hear a rational voice to anchor me to reality. When he answered my pounding on his door, dressed in a bathrobe and clearly annoyed at being disturbed, I must have looked like a madman, wild-eyed, sweating despite the cold, babbling about creatures in the forest and narrow escapes. But Tom could see that something had genuinely terrified me. He brought me inside, made coffee, and listened while I described the events of the evening. When I finished my account, he sat in silence for several minutes, studying my face as if trying to determine whether I was lying or simply insane. Finally, he suggested that I drive to Hamilton in the morning and stay at the motel there until I could arrange more permanent accommodations. I spent the remainder of the night in Tom's guest room, but sleep was impossible. Every sound outside, wind in the trees, a car passing on the highway, sent adrenaline surging through my system. When dawn finally broke, gray and cold, I felt like I'd aged a decade in a single night. The mirror in Tom's bathroom showed a stranger with hollow eyes and deep lines that hadn't been there the day before. The drive to Hamilton took 2 hours through mountainous terrain that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. But every mile of wilderness felt like a threat. Every stand of forest a potential hiding place for things that shouldn't exist. Only when I reached the outskirts of Hamilton with its suburban houses and chain restaurants did the knot in my chest begin to loosen. I checked into the Ponderosa Motel and spent the day trying to reach my children by phone. Michael was in meetings that couldn't be interrupted. Sarah was in court and wouldn't return my call until evening. David was traveling on business and might not get my message for days. I'd lived independently for 63 years, but suddenly I felt desperately alone and vulnerable. When Sarah finally called that evening, I tried to explain what had happened without sounding like a complete lunatic. I told her about the livestock kills, the strange sounds from the forest, and my decision to leave the ranch temporarily. I didn't mention Sasquatch or the trail camera footage. Some truths were too dangerous to share. Sarah was relieved that I'd finally admitted I couldn't live alone on the ranch indefinitely. She offered to fly out immediately and help me arrange the move to Chicago. Within a week, I was living in Michael's spare bedroom in a downtown apartment building, surrounded by the noise and activity of urban life. The adjustment was traumatic in its own way. Too many people, too much concrete, too little sky. But at night, when the city lights held back the darkness and human voices echoed in the hallways, I felt safe for the first time in months. I lived in Chicago for 8 months before finally gathering the courage to return to the ranch. Michael had been trying to convince me to put the property on the market, to make a clean break from the past and start fresh in civilization. But 127 acres of prime Montana real estate represented my life's work, my family's legacy. I couldn't abandon it without at least retrieving my personal belongings and Margaret's family heirlooms. The drive back to Montana felt like traveling into the past. Every mile west carried me further from the safety of cities and deeper into the wilderness that had nearly claimed my life. When I finally turned onto the ranch road in early July, my hands were trembling so badly I could barely steer. But I had to know what had become of my home, had to face whatever waited in the place I'd fled. The house was still standing, but barely. What I found defied explanation and challenged every assumption about the limits of destruction that nature could inflict. The structure looked like it had been hit by a tornado, not the random damage of high winds, but the systematic demolition that only intelligence could accomplish. The front porch had been torn away from the foundation, its support posts snapped like matchsticks. Windows were shattered from the inside out, as if something immensely powerful had struck them from within the house. The front door hung from one hinge, its heavy oak planks split and gouged by what could only have been claws or massive fingers. Inside, the destruction was even more complete. Furniture had been reduced to kindling, scattered throughout rooms like the aftermath of an explosion. The kitchen table where Margaret and I had shared 40 years of meals was nothing but splinters. Her grandmother's china cabinet lay on its side, the delicate porcelain ground to powder beneath what must have been enormous feet. Even the cast iron wood stove had been overturned, its chimney pipe torn from the ceiling and bent into impossible angles. But it was the systematic nature of the destruction that truly chilled me. This wasn't random vandalism or the work of natural disasters. Every family photograph had been deliberately shattered, the frames torn apart and the images scattered like confetti. Margaret's jewelry box had been opened and its contents strewn across the bedroom floor, not stolen, just destroyed for the sake of destruction. Books that had been in my family for generations were torn apart, their pages carpeting the living room in a layer of literary snow. The stairs to the second floor had been ripped from the wall, leaving only jagged remnants of what had once been a beautiful hand-carved banister. Upstairs, the bedrooms told the same story of methodical demolition. My clothes had been shredded, the dresser drawers pulled out and smashed against the walls. Even the mattresses had been torn open, their stuffing scattered like the entrails of some massive beast. In what had been Margaret's sewing room, I found evidence that made my blood run cold. Massive handprints pressed into the drywall, each finger clearly defined in the white powder. The prints were easily twice the size of my own hands, with a span that suggested fingers of impossible length and strength. But most disturbing was their placement. Some were 8 feet off the floor, others pressed into the ceiling itself, as if whatever made them had been moving across the walls and roof like some enormous spider. The basement revealed the final horror. My workshop, where I'd spent countless hours crafting furniture and repairing equipment, had been completely destroyed. Tools that had been in my family for generations were twisted into unrecognizable shapes. My father's anvil, which weighed over 200 pounds, had been hurled across the room with such force that it had embedded itself 6 inches into the concrete wall. The workbench, built from solid oak timbers, had been reduced to splinters no larger than toothpicks. But it was what I found in the corner that finally broke my spirit. Margaret's grave marker, the simple granite stone that had marked her final resting place, lay in pieces on the basement floor. The creatures had desecrated even the dead, violating the one thing I considered truly sacred. Rage and grief overwhelmed me in equal measure, and I fell to my knees among the fragments of stone that bore my wife's name. The message was clear. This had been my punishment for fleeing, for abandoning the territory that the creatures had claimed as their own. They had taken everything, my home, my possessions, my memories, even the marker that honored my wife's memory. Nothing remained of the life Robert Patrick had built except ruins and the bitter knowledge that some battles cannot be won. I spent less than an hour in that devastated house, gathering only those few items that had somehow survived the systematic destruction. Margaret's wedding ring, which I'd left on the nightstand and found miraculously intact beneath a pile of torn photographs. A single family Bible that had been overlooked in the chaos. The .306 rifle, which I discovered broken in half but still recognizable as the weapon that had belonged to my grandfather. As I prepared to leave for the final time, I noticed fresh footprints in the dirt around the house. Massive, clearly defined prints that couldn't have been more than a few days old. They were watching me even now, observing my reaction to their handiwork from the safety of the forest. The thought that they might be planning another encounter sent me running for the truck with an urgency that bordered on panic. The drive back to Chicago passed in a blur of conflicting emotions. Relief at escaping the ranch alive warred with grief over everything I'd lost. The physical destruction was devastating enough, but the violation of Margaret's grave had cut deeper than any material loss. These creatures possessed not just intelligence and strength, but a capacity for cruelty that spoke to something fundamentally evil in their nature. I never reported the destruction to the authorities. How could I explain that my house had been demolished by creatures that officially didn't exist? The insurance company would demand evidence of the cause: wind damage, vandalism, fire, none of which applied to my situation. I was completely alone with knowledge that I couldn't share, couldn't prove, and couldn't escape. Michael was shocked by my appearance when I returned to his apartment. The brief trip to Montana had aged me visibly, adding new lines to my face and a hollow quality to my eyes that spoke of trauma beyond description. When he asked about the condition of the ranch, I told him the house had been badly damaged by weather and vandalism, that it would cost more to repair than the property was worth. The lie came easily, too easily, but the truth would have destroyed what remained of my credibility. Sarah flew to Chicago the following week to help finalize the sale of the ranch. A real estate agent specializing in remote properties agreed to handle the transaction site unseen, marketing it as a fixer-upper for buyers interested in wilderness living. The asking price was low enough to attract immediate interest, and within 2 months, the deed was transferred to a young couple from California who planned to build a sustainable homestead on the land. I never warned them about what lived in the forest. How could I? They would have dismissed my story as the ramblings of a senile old man, just as the forest ranger had done months earlier. Besides, perhaps the creatures would leave new owners alone, would respect different boundaries than those they'd established with my family. It was a cowardly hope, but hope nonetheless. The money from the sale allowed me to purchase a small condominium in a suburb of Chicago, close enough to Michael's family for regular visits, but independent enough to maintain some dignity. I filled my days with volunteer work at the local library, helping visitors research genealogy and local history. The work kept my mind occupied and provided human contact that helped push back the isolation that had nearly destroyed me in Montana. But the nights remained difficult. Urban sounds, sirens, traffic, the rumble of elevated trains couldn't completely mask the memories of wood knocks echoing through silent forests. Every shadow between buildings reminded me of massive shapes moving through moonlight. Sleep came only with the aid of prescription medications that left me groggy and disconnected during the daylight hours. 3 years have passed since I abandoned the ranch to whatever claimed it from the wilderness. In that time, I've learned to function in a world that has no place for the truth I carry. I smile and nod when people speak of Bigfoot as folklore. When television shows treat cryptid encounters as entertainment, I've become skilled at changing the subject when conversations turn to unexplained phenomena or mysterious disappearances in national forests. But I monitor the news from Montana obsessively, searching for reports that might indicate the creatures have expanded their territory or encountered new victims. Last spring, a backpacker vanished in Glacier National Park under circumstances that the authorities couldn't explain. His campsite was found destroyed, his equipment scattered across a wide area, but his body was never recovered. The official report blamed a bear attack, but the description of the damage reminded me too strongly of my own experiences. 6 months ago, I received an unexpected phone call from Tom Kowalski in Millerville. The young couple who'd purchased my ranch had lasted less than a year before abandoning the property and fleeing to Seattle. They'd told neighbors about strange sounds from the forest, livestock that disappeared overnight, and equipment that was mysteriously destroyed. When Tom described their experiences, I felt the familiar chill of recognition. The creatures were still there, still protecting their territory, still eliminating any human presence that ventured too close to their domain. The ranch remains empty now, officially for sale, but attracting no serious buyers. Local real estate agents whisper about the property being cursed, about multiple families who've tried and failed to make a life there. The asking price drops every few months, but even desperate buyers seem to sense something wrong with the land. Perhaps animals possess instincts that warn them away from places where predators hunt. Perhaps some truths are too dangerous to ignore, even when reason demands their dismissal. I keep the trail camera footage on a digital drive hidden in my bedroom closet, the only proof of what I witnessed that October night. Sometimes, in the darkest hours before dawn, I watch it again and remember the intelligence in those reflected eyes, the deliberate malevolence in every movement. The creature knew it was being recorded and wanted me to see what it was capable of, wanted me to understand that I was living in its territory by sufferance alone. Michael worries about my mental health, suggests that therapy might help me process the trauma of losing the family ranch. Sarah calls weekly to check on my adjustment to city life, offering to help me find activities that might ease the transition. David sends cards and emails from whatever exotic location his business has taken him to, sharing photographs of places where the closest thing to wilderness is a manicured park. They're good children, caring and attentive, but they live in a world where monsters exist only in movies and family legends. I've considered writing down everything I experienced, creating a complete record that might warn future victims or help researchers understand what lurks in the deep wilderness. But who would believe such an account? The scientific community dismisses cryptid encounters as misidentification and wishful thinking. Law enforcement treats such reports as evidence of mental instability. Even my own family would likely interpret a written confession as proof that isolation and grief had finally driven me over the edge into complete delusion. So I remain silent, carrying knowledge that grows heavier with each passing day. Somewhere in the mountains of western Montana, intelligent predators maintain territory that humans enter at their own peril. They possess the cunning to avoid scientific detection and the strength to eliminate any threat to their domain. They remember faces, hold grudges, and demonstrate a capacity for methodical revenge that speaks to intelligence equal to or exceeding our own. The security camera footage captured more than just an animal attack on my chicken coop. It documented the existence of beings that challenge everything we think we know about the natural world. Creatures that possess the worst qualities of both human and animal nature. They are patient, intelligent, and utterly ruthless in protecting what they consider theirs. I was lucky to escape with my life. The young couple who tried to replace me were fortunate to recognize the danger before it was too late. But others won't be so wise or so quick to retreat. The wilderness is vast, and these creatures have learned to exploit human arrogance and skepticism to their advantage. They know we won't believe the survivors, won't take precautions against threats that science refuses to acknowledge. Every time I see news reports about missing hikers or unexplained disappearances in remote areas, I wonder if another family is about to learn what I learned that October night. I wonder if somewhere in the darkness between the trees, ancient eyes are watching new victims and calculating the perfect moment to strike. The knowledge that I could warn them, could save them, weighs on my conscience like a physical burden. But who would listen to an old man's tale of monsters in the forest? Who would believe that the stuff of nightmares walks on two legs through the wilderness, leaving footprints too large for any known animal and demonstration intelligence too advanced for any creature science has cataloged? The trail camera footage remains hidden in my closet, 36 minutes of proof that the world is far stranger and more dangerous than most people can accept. Someday, perhaps, I'll find the courage to share it with someone who might believe, someone with the authority and resources to investigate further. But until that day comes, I'll continue living with the knowledge that there are things in the wilderness that view humans not as the dominant species on this planet, but as prey. The house where 5 generations of Patricks made their home now stands empty, its windows dark and its doors secured against nothing more dangerous than weather and vandals. But the forest that surrounds it teems with intelligence older and more cunning than our own, creatures that have learned to thrive in the spaces between human knowledge and human belief. I survived my encounter with the unknown, but I'll never truly escape it. Every night when I turn off the lights in my safe suburban condominium, I remember the sound of massive footsteps circling my home. Every shadow reminds me of shapes moving through moonlight with predatory grace. Every unexplained sound in the darkness brings back the memory of woodknocks echoing through silent trees. Messages pass between creatures that humanity refuses to acknowledge. The trail camera captured the truth that October night. The question that haunts me is whether anyone will ever be ready to accept what it reveals. Whether our species has the courage to acknowledge that we share this world with intelligences that learn to hunt us, long before we learn to hunt them. In the deep wilderness, where cell phones don't work and the nearest help is days away, ancient predators still claim territory that human maps have never accurately charted. They watch from the tree line, patient and calculating, waiting for the next family to build a home too close to their domain. And when that family arrives, full of confidence in their technological superiority and scientific understanding, they'll discover what I learned in the mountains of western Montana. Some legends are real, some monsters walk on 2 legs, and some truths are too dangerous for civilized society to accept, no matter how compelling the evidence might be. The footage exists, the creatures endure, and somewhere in the wilderness, they're still watching, still waiting, still protecting territory that humans enter at their own peril. My name is Robert Patrick, and this is why I'll never go home again. For more interesting stories like this one, considering checking out this crazy one,